Sure, we'll do. Okay, so first of all, I'd like to thank all of our sponsors. I mean, their generous contributions certainly support our entire TMA platform. A couple of announcements, upcoming events. We have the TMA MARC conference in Milwaukee next week, Sunday to Tuesday. And then also coming up April 28th, a week from today, we have at the Madison in downtown Detroit, we have a private screening of the Detroit bankruptcy documentary. The director of the film will be there. I guess I should probably get to the best part. There's a premium open bar that usually does it, but there's also complimentary appetizers and a couple parking garages nearby. So that's next Thursday. So if you have a second, go ahead and sign up for that. And then on May 4th, we have our first annual TMA Turnaround of the Year Awards and our Lifetime Achievement Award. That'll be held at the DoubleTree Hotel in Bloomfield Hills. Some of you know that as the former Kingsley. Okay, let me introduce our panelists today. First, Steve Gross from McDonald Hopkins. Steve's a member and co-chair of the firm's Business Restructuring Department, chairman of the Automotive Practice Group, and was the original managing partner of the firm's Detroit office. Steve also serves on the firm's board of directors. For over 35 years, he's been extensively involved in business restructuring matters, corporate acquisitions and divestitures, especially in the auto industry, other manufacturing businesses, and large regional franchisees. Walt Popiel from Riveron. Walt specializes in providing turnaround, crisis management, and enterprise value enhancement services to both performing and underperforming companies in a variety of industries, including automotive, aerospace, and many others. Walt's experience includes interim officer appointments, customer and creditor negotiations, treasury management, viability assessments, and transaction advisory services. David Nolletti from Riveron. David was a late add to our group. His calendar opened up and we're happy to have him. David's the managing director out of their New York office and leads the firm's aerospace, defense, and government contractor practice. In addition to his years of financial advisory experience, David has approximately 20 years aerospace industry experience with research roles, C-suite, and board positions. Prior to his professional life, David was a commissioned officer in both active duty and in the reserves. Myself, Mike Boudreau, I'm with MorrisAnderson. I've been delivering professional services for over 20 years, workout restructuring, balance sheet recaps, enterprise improvement. I've represented debtors and lenders, federal bankruptcy experience, as well as state court receiverships and assigning for the benefit of creditors. Industry experience certainly weighted towards manufacturing, auto, aerospace, and others, and other Midwestern type entities. But I'm not a career consultant, having had CFO and treasury roles in both automotive and other manufacturing environments. And last but not least, Paul Kueber. Paul is the founder of Maybury Partners, with over 25 years experience in turnaround and restructuring with smaller and mid-market companies. Okay, enough about us. So some opening comments before I turn it over to the guys. First, a 10,000-foot overview. I mean, it's been said that when the Boeings of the world catch a cold, the supply chain tends to get pneumonia. Just some news that's been out there in the first, second quarter. Boeing had suspended titanium purchases from Russia, which is adding to more shortages in the supply chain. The stock price has been trending towards the 52-week low. I would say the same thing for Airbus. Their Raytheon Pratt & Whitney units announced back late in the first quarter that they wouldn't ship 70 engines to Airbus due to casting shortages. We're seeing stress in the supply chain as production ramps up. Aircraft deliveries may be delayed from this year, 2022 into 23. Forgings and castings are experiencing shortages due to their lead times. Both Delta and American stock prices are trading towards their 52-week lows. Lockheed Martin, on the other hand, which is more defense, is trending towards its 52-week high, I suspect, because of defense related in Russia and what's happening over there. So with that, let me turn it over to Paul and David, and they can take a closer look at the industry.
All right, so thanks, Mike. Just a snapshot, the U.S. as you can see, is the largest aircraft manufacturer in the world with an industry revenue of 231 billion. They manufacture complete aircraft engines, propulsion systems, and the supply chain not only makes related parts, but also prototype and auxiliary equipment. Some of the big dogs that Mike mentioned, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, GE Aviation have about 38%. And then demand comes from air transportation, federal funding for defense, and non-NATO spending. Next slide, Amanda, please. So I'll take just the first two bullets here and then I'll hand it over to David. But from trends, if you look at from really 2000 up through 2018, the commercial aerospace sector experienced nearly continuous growth with deliveries more than doubling. So if you think about it, from Boeing and Airbus, they reached almost 1,900 combined aircrafts. And the supply chain, because of this, really had to make continued efforts to ramp up that production almost continually. So, David?
Yeah, Paul, thank you. I mean, really exceptional growth throughout that period. So as Boeing and Airbus ramped, the entire supply chain ramped up and actually was continuing to invest to increase production to get us over 2,000 aircraft a year. And then what happened? We had COVID hit in 2020, and we had the Boeing 737 MAX issues that caused the grounding and stoppage of deliveries of those aircraft. So in 2020, we had a normal first quarter. The industry was growing its usual 5% a year in terms of passenger growth. COVID hits, and year over year demand dropped by more than 90% versus 2019, the biggest downturn in the history of commercial aviation. You know, since then, what we've seen is a little bit of a recovery, but it's bifurcated. We've had large domestic markets like the US, Russia, China, Brazil, achieving pre-pandemic levels of passenger demand, or perhaps even a little higher. Meanwhile, long-haul international travel is still down more than 60% versus where we were in 2019. So it's a tale of two cities. To kind of pile on, we've had jet fuel prices have more than doubled in the last year, and they're up more than 30% year to date. So really hitting the airlines hard in terms of profitability. And then, as was mentioned earlier, the war in the Ukraine is having a definitive impact on titanium. Russia produces about 40% of the world's aerospace grade titanium. VSMPO Visma is the largest producer of titanium in the world, and they're located in Russia. And then the Ukraine is a leading producer of titanium raw materials that go into making sponge and then ultimately alloy. We're seeing quite a bit of labor constraint and wage inflation in the supply chain. You know, the Great Resignation is a real thing, and it's particularly impacting this industry where skilled labor and skilled machinists are kind of a rare commodity, and keeping those folks in the supply chain has gotten harder and harder. You know, so when we look at it, the pandemic and then the global supply chain impacts, they're rippling through the entire industry. It's an ecosystem. It's fed by passenger demand, and that impacts airports, airport authorities, car leasing or rental companies, fuel servicing companies, aircraft manufacturers, and component producers, not to mention aircraft MRO. So it's really just changed the entire dynamic of the supply chain. And when you look at our ability to forecast recovery and what's going to happen, the pandemic has just challenged all the norms and usual forecasting capabilities in the industry. Truly a once in a career kind of experience here.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Next slide, Amanda. So just continuing on trends, looking at 2017 through 21, there was a significant amount of volatility in these 5 years, and really it's primarily due to military spending with the winding down of major wars, and then as well trying to reduce the budget deficit through something called sequestration. And so, but however, we are seeing an increase to 670 billion in 2021 for defense spending. David, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, when you look at what's happened in air traffic demand over the segment, the commercial segment in this period, it's kind of stalled. You know, we've seen production peak, and then obviously production fell off dramatically. Boeing stopped deliveries of the MAX. They've temporarily halted deliveries of the 787 wide body product. And as we're starting to try and recover, we're seeing, real pressure in the supply chain with raw material availability and pricing. When you look at Boeing, Spirit AeroSystems, and the supply chain, Boeing in particular, during the MAX shutdown and the pandemic, really tried to keep supply chain orders up pretty high. The aerospace supply chain is built on middle market companies. And if we slow down and then speed back up, that lag effect is very challenging to manage. So Boeing kept rates up really high for a long period of time. And what that caused was a buildup in inventories. I did a quick analysis last year that is largely still true, that during the second quarter of 2021, Boeing had about 3 times as much inventory per aircraft shipped as they had at the peak of production in 2018. It's going to take a long time for that excess inventory to bleed off before the demand of production ramps really hits the supply chain. So we're going to see an extended period of time of fairly low demand for the suppliers here domestically. The FAA grounding the MAX was obviously a catastrophic event for Boeing and a terrible experience for all the families that were impacted. Airbus has managed to pick up about 10 points of market share in the single aisle market as a result of that. And Airbus is taking some pretty aggressive measures to try and maintain that share by ramping up production and feed deliveries where Boeing has been unable to do so.
So just thinking out loud a little bit, David. So, you comment on the growing inventories. So if I'm a middle market owned supplier in that supply chain, I mean, that could be a big problem as we move forward, because if my line of credit is inching towards its cap or increasing for whatever reasons, inflation, whatever other issues I might be having, now my top line is going to start, my production requirements are going to start going lower because the excess supply at the ultimate customer, if I'm hearing you right.
Absolutely. And, a lot of the engagements I've done in the supply chain are with suppliers that have made it through the downturn. They survived the worst part of the COVID pandemic. They survived the 737 MAX shutdown, but they were funding operating losses. And usually those show up on their balance sheet as consuming lines of credit or other credit facilities that they have in place. And now they're looking at it and they're saying, how do I fund the ramp up? How do I sustain my operations at relatively low levels of production when I was facilitized to make, say, 52 737s a month? Now I'm making 22 or 20 or 18 ship sets a month. How do I get through this? And working through that cash flow situation, understanding where they can generate excess cash to help fund the operation. That's been a lot of the work we've been doing over the last year to 16, 18 months.
Yeah. We didn't get a chance to talk about it in our pre-sessions, but I was just reading, I meant to mention to you the other day, and I just want to see if you have any comment. If you don't, it's fine. It's not a big deal. If I'm not mistaken, there was a plane in China that went down about a month ago. And I think that was a Boeing plane. Are you seeing anything negativity attached to Boeing as a supply chain because of that?
No, that was a 737-800 aircraft, not a MAX. So it was the previous generation. They're still not sure what happened. They've recovered the black boxes from the incident and they're being analyzed. The FAA is assisting, but they really haven't determined a cause. And I believe that China has authorized the 737-800 fleet to return to service pending the outcome of the investigation. There is, though, in China a little bit of a little bit of gamesmanship going on with our trade policy there. It's impacting our ability to deliver aircraft into China. A lot of people don't recognize that Boeing is the largest exporter by dollar value, or at least they were in 2018 in the country. And as we've placed restrictions on trade with China, particularly in terms of technology, the Chinese have responded by attempting to restrict delivery of certain aircraft into the market as a way of exercising some leverage. And they have done that successfully, and Boeing is reducing production as a result.
All right, thanks.
Sure.
All right, next slide. So just looking forward to 22 through 27, in terms of air travel, domestic demand is actually, we're expecting that it would achieve pre-pandemic levels this year, and international demand won't achieve it this year. They're expecting 24 or 25, and really it's about, I mean, that's where these airlines make all their money, with these wide body flights and wide body production, and because of that, it's really going to put them under stress.
Yeah, I mean, when we get in and do an evaluation of a company, understanding programmatic exposure is super important to understanding the likelihood of success and what the turnaround could look like. You know, understanding if it's a wide body or a narrow body producer, and what the trends are likely to look like for those particular market segments, are very important when getting into the middle market aerospace segment.
Great. Okay.
Do you want me to keep
Yeah, keep
going, or are you
going.
going to go, Paul? Okay.
Yeah, keep going.
You know, on the federal side, a lot of people don't recognize the F-35 is the largest, in terms of dollar values, the largest military program, aircraft program in the history of the world. We're producing about 130 a year, but the total program forecast is for over 5,000 aircraft, about evenly split between US and foreign allies. That production is going to continue. KC-46 is continuing, the new tanker built based on a 767. The TX trainer is in production. That's a few hundred aircraft there for the US military. And the B-21 stealth bomber is picking up speed. I think the last thing I read was there's about 6 prototypes that are in construction, and that aircraft is going to be designed to take over for the B-52 and the B-1 and the B-2s as we start to retire those fleets. So it's going to be a very large volume program, very valuable. You know, when we look at the industry profits, all the pressure that we're feeling, at whether it's at the pump or at the grocery store, or even building a home or doing anything domestically, the producers are feeling right now. Raw material prices, fuel prices, labor increases are really like coming to bear this quarter. I don't know if anyone's flown recently, but prices, aircraft ticket prices, are definitely reflecting the uptick in fuel. Fuel is about 40% of an aircraft or an airline's cost basis or direct cost basis, and they're passing it along to the consumer, and prices have come up dramatically in the last quarter. But so we expect to see a lot of price pressure coming into this year and next.
Next slide. So just continuing on the trends in the first bullet, really all I wanted to mention was in the middle there. It says the industry supply chain contains over 1,000 small to medium-sized suppliers serving only a few OEMs. The parts range from fasteners all the way up to wings. So there's a lot of pressure on all of these suppliers to reduce costs, basically based on what David was saying. Anything else on that, David?
No, I have nothing to add there.
Okay, next slide. Oh, go ahead.
I got a quick question for either one of you guys. So if I think back to like the 90s and early 2000s here in Detroit, and the automotive industry, especially in the 90s, there was a big push on the companies to reduce the supply base, the number of the small suppliers, you know, the middle market guys, and single source parts and things like that. Have you guys seen any of that in the aerospace slot?
Yeah, we definitely have seen a lot of consolidation in the sector. You know, private equity has been drawn to the aerospace sector over the last 15 years because of the nearly continuous growth that we've seen. And we know that one of the things private equity loves is a built-in growth story. And we've had that. So private equity has done a lot of consolidation. The big players, you know, the publicly traded companies, have done some of the largest transactions of the year over the last couple of years, have been in the aerospace and defense sectors. And we expect to see that to continue because for all its size, the aerospace market is still very fragmented. Lots of small players, lots of niche technologies and smaller companies with a great technical reason to exist that are attractive acquisitions for other players in the sector.
Okay, thanks.
One follow-up to that, when we did the deal that we're going to talk about later, Walt and I had the chance to tour, a couple of the Boeing facilities, led by, their head of suppliers, at least one of the three groups that they had at the time. And, he said to me, as we were walking through the plant, and this was long before any of this distress started, the MAX issue had just come to light. It was long before COVID. And at the time, he had delivery and issues with 1,000 suppliers every day. Not all financial, some were just delivery, but which is mind-boggling because in automotive, I can't imagine, Mark Fisher or somebody from GM dealing with 1,000 suppliers. It's just mind-boggling. That's how fragmented it is.
Yeah, you were kind of going in and out there for a second, Steve. Of those 1,000 suppliers, were you saying that they were short shipping?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Mike, this is,
He was having trouble with 1,000 suppliers on every given day. That
yeah,
was his
Mike.
average.
Yeah, there were 1,000 issues on the short ship board, but what was more amazing, I think, to Steve and I, was he said, yeah, well, we're not proud of that number. It's well in excess of our target. And we said, well, what's your target? And he said 200. And he asked, well, what are you guys used to seeing? And I said, the answer is 0.
Yeah.
The target is 0.
Yeah.
So, it does speak to the dynamics. And I think to David's point, and it speaks to it on this slide, especially for our Midwest audience who's got, a lot of experience and feet in the area. Don't forget, and David, you may have mentioned this, like 50 to 60% of the tooling for aerospace and prototypes comes out of this area. It's Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and Wisconsin. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense, right? You've got this huge expertise in tool making in high volume environments. So, there is a high likelihood that if you're dealing with tooling or prototype shops, there is a significant aerospace component.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, agreed. Okay.
All right, let me keep going. So in terms of a geographic overview, I mean, you can kind of see the big dog out there out west with Boeing, 26%, and all of the suppliers that feed into that. But what's kind of interesting is Southeast and Southwest makes up 35%, and that's really because they're right to work states with lower costs. And then in there, you can see the Texas with 8%, Lockheed Martin, and that's really what David was talking about with the F-35.
Yeah. Yeah, when you look at the traditional aerospace hubs, Seattle, of course, Los Angeles, there's a corridor from Wichita, Kansas down to the DFW Metroplex. Certainly the Detroit area, as Walter was just mentioning, south to probably St. Louis, Missouri, where Boeing has a large presence. And then you've got a historical hub in Connecticut and Long Island that's still pretty substantial, and a new hub that Boeing is creating in North Charleston, where they started the second 787 line, and Airbus in Mobile, Alabama is making A320 and A220s there. So it's really moved to those right to work states, but literally coast to coast, it's major industry in just about every section of the country.
David, what were you saying about the F-35 the other day? It's in every congressional district.
Yeah, I mean, F-35 is when our elected officials see that, everyone's fighting for their district to get to participate. And I think if you did a map of suppliers for F-35, it would literally touch every congressional district in the country.
Okay, cool.
All right, next slide. So just talking about industry revenue from 17 through 20 in the forecast, you can kind of see what we're talking about with these gyrations because of COVID and the 737. You can see the drops and as well as the increases all the way until, if you look in the center where it says year over year change, you can see the change all the way down to 22. And then beyond 22, from 23 to 27, it's really expected to settle down with increases of only, 1.5 to 2.5%.
Yeah, it's interesting because, this, we talked about this trend when we got together to talk about this webinar, and deliveries from the commercial suppliers dropped by more than half. So there's still a lot of revenue rolling around in the system, but actual aircraft deliveries, commercial deliveries dropped substantially. Meanwhile, F-35 picked up in 2021, so they kind of made up some ground. But really, I was surprised at the numbers coming out of Ibis World, simply because of the disconnect it apparently has between Boeing's deliveries and what the forecast numbers were showing. But it definitely shows that big drop, 2019, 2020, combined of 11.7%, which is just staggering when you think about it.
Mhm. Okay.
All right, next slide. So just talking about fundamental business drivers, starting with just orders, backlog status, and production requirements. Then the rest of this all comes down to people, equipment, and supply chain. So if you talk about people, it's really what David was talking about earlier with labor costs and expertise and people leaving the workforce, just not being able to retain your people. And then equipment, knowing that it's, if you look at like the fourth bullet, it's such a capital intensive business where it requires a lot of capital. Knowing that you have your volumes changing so dramatically, it is really, really a struggle for these suppliers to keep the equipment that they have, as well as get rid of the equipment they don't need. And then supply chain, knowing that the supply chain with all of the material, commodity, freight, the lockup that we had in Los Angeles, just on and on and on, all the issues that the supply chain's having, it's a mess right now. And you can really see it in all these different areas. David, did you want to jump in?
I think you covered it. I mean, those are the key elements. Right now, if I were to kind of, based on the engagements we're working now, the supply chain is definitely causing us the most hassle, followed by labor. But it's not getting better. For example, I was just working a problem with a client today where we can't get adhesive for a metal-to-metal bond process anywhere in the country. I need 10 gallons of the stuff. We can't find it anywhere because of supply chain interruptions upstream from my supplier. And those are literally going on every day.
Yeah. Hey, David, in the engagements that you are working on and have been working on, I mean, like, for an example, most of the situations I've seen in the supply chain, our clients are selling on a fixed price.
Mm-hmm.
Are you coming across anybody these days, because we're in a different world, where they already had built-in commodity price escalators into their contracts or POs?
Yeah, in the aerospace industry, firm fixed price, 3 to 5 year contracts are really common as the manufacturers try and lock in their cost structure.
Yeah.
I haven't seen a lot where you are able to pass through commodity price increases on a real-time basis. A lot of them will have adjustments, perhaps every year, perhaps every quarter, every half year, but most of them are locked in pretty tight with the federal government also. And the federal government has been very reluctant to give EPA's economic price adjustments in spite of the inflation that we're seeing.
Okay. All right. Thanks.
Yeah.
All right, next slide. I'm going to try to speed up here a little bit. So I just wanted to highlight the middle bullet there, and Mike mentioned this earlier. You can see with all the issues that we have going on in the supply chain and the risks that you can see with when the Boeings of the world catch a cold, the supply chain gets pneumonia, and you can kind of see that throughout this entire presentation. So next slide. Just some examples before we get into the actual case studies. Boeing supplier Impressa filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in September 2020. It was due to production delays resulting from the grounding of the 737 MAX, as well as COVID. And assets were sold to Vertex Aerospace, which is owned by American Industrial Partners. David, do you want to talk about these?
Sure. Another large bankruptcy that took place in the sector was Tech Aerospace. They filed in Q2 of 21, and it was an interesting case because Boeing was their largest customer. They were also their lender on a pre-filing basis, and then also supplied the DIP, and really put Boeing in a position to kind of manage their supply chain risk throughout the process. And that's really where their biggest concern was. So the Washington State portion of the business was sold to a third-party buyer, and then the Kansas assets were liquidated by Boeing after a wind down period where they transferred the statements of work elsewhere.
Next slide. So just talking about from a consultant standpoint, and we'll just quickly run through this. So the first point is forecasting, tight managing your weekly actuals, break even, all costs need to be managed. As we talked before, it's such a working capital intensive industry that it's really important to target working capital and make sure that's efficient. You understand that. Really, this all comes down to the bottom 2 points. It's customer involvement, it's communication, and then customer accommodations, price increases, changes in payment terms. David, anything on that?
I think that's the playbook. I mean, get control of the cash, get your forecast worked out, and then work with your customers both on delivery schedules and accommodations to stabilize the business.
Hey guys, just real quick, we had a question come in from Chad, and I'll throw it out to the group and say, what production levels do Boeing and Airbus need to get to for the supply chain to stabilize? And I don't know if it's totally a volume issue, but anyways, that's the question. Thoughts?
That's a good question. It's a fairly on the Airbus side. I think on the narrow body, we see healthy production rate now. Boeing is probably running in the low 20s on 737. They probably need to get somewhere into the upper 30s to low 40s to really get those facilities back to some level of utilization. We're probably looking at 18 months, perhaps a little bit longer to get there. The wide body segment is going to be where the real crusher is, because like 787 went from 14 a month, and I think right now we're producing at 1, but we haven't delivered a 787 in probably 5 months. So there needs to be some pretty substantial ramp up. And given the forecast of international demand not returning until maybe 24 or 25, those line rates are going to be very low for a long time. And you'd probably have to get to 10 a month on 787, for example, for those suppliers who are heavily focused on that platform to be healthy.
And David, Airbus is hitting their line rates on the 320 and the 320 variants at what, 60 aircraft, just for some perspective on Boeing's numbers. So Boeing's doing targeting about half to be moving up the chain.
Okay, great. Thank you. Steve and Walt, do you guys want to jump into your case study?
Yeah, sure. I'll start off.
Amanda, if you could move ahead 2 slides. There you go. Yep, thanks.
Yeah, so, in one of the earlier slides, there was a reference to, suppliers producing everything from fasteners to wings. And this was a supplier who produced fasteners and then decided to produce wings. And really the background was very successful family-owned, family fund-owned facilities in Connecticut, Atlanta, or outside of Atlanta and Mexico, making fasteners and screws, very simple parts, primarily for Boeing, probably 90% of their business. When Boeing started its facility in the Carolinas, with much public fanfare, this supplier built a huge facility there to make wings. And from there, really everything, as it often does, went sideways because the facility was losing a significant amount of money. They had 2 contracts. It took them a year longer than projected to start building the first kind of wing. There were all kinds of tolerance, safety, and other compliance with contract issues. Ultimately, they contacted me. I brought in Walt and his team because this really wasn't a a contract issue. We started off by raising all the UCC defenses and playing that game. But if you drill down, ultimately we had a big breach problem. And this was, like I said earlier, before COVID, before the max, it was very much an education process with the company first to explain to them that Boeing is going to have a big issue if you guys shut down. Boeing was pounding the table. Here's what you owe us, pay us. You have a well-heeled owner, just put the money in. And the point was, the owners are not going to put more money in because it's money down a hole. And if we go to them and say we're going to shut down, ultimately it's going to cost them a lot more money to resource this.
Mhm.
So it took a while. We put that strategy together. We approached the lender, got the lender on board with it. The lender was pretty much covered, mostly by assets, if not by, backstop by other entities and guarantees. And we went to Boeing a few times, Walt and I. We had a lot of fun because they weren't used to the word accommodations at the time. They are now. And we presented this as accommodations, and it was, I think, in their view of the world, it was extortion. And seriously, the initial meetings, Boeing's a pretty big organization, and I don't think the people who were doing the wings said, we'll just leave it with our existing wing supplier. It's not much of a threat, although it was. And we pointed out to them, well, you have all these fasteners that are coming out of Mexico and you can't build your planes. And they literally went on every plane that Boeing made. And while there were simple parts, there were thousands of them. So if you just stopped that, it would have just, brought Boeing to a halt. So, we had, the typical dance with them. And ultimately, they brought in some internal restructuring people that they got from outside, which really helped the process because we were able to get their purchasing and engineering people on the side, and we're able to talk bigger concepts. So, ultimately we ended up, it was not an accommodation agreement. It was a settlement agreement. It had to be their way, but it basically looked exactly like an accommodation agreement.
Mhm.
We continued production of the one wing part for a period of time. They paid expedited payments, wave set off. They paid all the expedited freight. They could buy the tooling. They would let us out of the other contract. We'd build an inventory bank. And then on their damage claim, which was a legitimate $36 million damage claim, ultimately, we weren't going to pay it. Equity wasn't going to pay it. The bank wasn't going to pay it. So we knocked it down by 75% and basically said if the company sold within a certain period of time, it would be paid. And if the company's not sold, then there was, some kind of term payment. So, using the traditional automotive playbook, we were able to essentially stabilize the company. They actually were able to restore profitability to the plant by bringing other work in there for non-Boeing related entities. And Walt has more visibility on that than I do. The initial plan was probably to sell the company, but last heard they had not. Maybe that's changed. So, all in all, that was a perfect example of how, because the economics of automotive are very similar to the economics and the leverage in aerospace, the same game plan works.
Yeah.
And these days, it is being used. You can see that in tech, where, Boeing came in and funded the dip just to control the process, much like GM has been doing for 20 years.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you want to jump in there.
I think there were really three key elements of that case, which are not present in every case, that we had to get Boeing over the hump on. The first was getting the ability versus desire to fund out of the way. As Steve mentioned, our owner was a billionaire with a B. And, first over the hump was, there is no willingness, and they feel betrayed. They were promised a lot, and they helped Boeing, which they did, literally helped Boeing establish the beachhead in order to produce at its 787 facility. And the owner did feel betrayed and said, I don't care. I'm not doing it. It's not a willingness, or I don't care about this 36 million. And I will never, ever, ever own another aerospace company again. And that is a big hump, because Boeing will hold that out, as will any of the OEMs will hold that out, that you're done in aerospace if you pull this maneuver. Now, I think those times have changed a little bit. But that was one. The other was having the bank on board, because it shifted from a desire, willingness to ability, because the bank said, as long as that claim sits out there, we're not renewing the note. And we had the benefit of a pending maturity. The third was the Mexico piece, which, as Steve mentioned, not sophisticated parts, but unfortunately for Boeing, they were in every single aircraft that they made. And they were in an unfortunate position where a number of those were up for renewal and hadn't had a price increase in some time. And so they really had sort of a three-headed tactical issue that they needed to resolve, which is ultimately what brought them to the table.
Yeah. When you guys were in this engagement, I'm curious. Of course, on the automotive side, all the OEMs, they have their trouble supplier groups and and things of that nature. When you were inside of Boeing at that time, did you sense that, was this a trouble supplier group, or were you dealing with the buyers that were just normally on that particular program?
Well, we were certainly dealing with the buyers and the legal team for a good chunk of it. And the writing was sort of on the wall with the 737 MAX that this was going to be an expanded exercise for them. And they brought in some talent from the outside, a very, very sophisticated individual who happened to be from Seattle, but was working through the European banking crisis for the prior 10 years of his career, but happened to be from Seattle. Once he got involved and he was building out his team, he's since built that team out to, David probably knows better, but it was probably 10 to 12 folks by the time we left. And they had some partnership arrangements with some additional consulting firms. But once we got into that audience, they sort of took over the shepherding of the internal Boeing folks. And that's really when the process moved. If it didn't, there was a reasonable chance it was going to take a process.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Just one other note, something that Walt mentioned, that Boeing's belief that the family would stand behind this is one of the characteristics, I think, of aerospace, where a lot of the mid-size suppliers are family-owned. It's been in the family for generations, and it's their identity. And people expect them to stay behind the same company. And there's still a lot of personal relationships in that space, which is, long gone from automotive. I think that's going to change because, as David mentioned, it's, the normal EBITDA and numbers you get on EBITDA transactions there is huge, way higher than a lot of other places. I mean, you're getting 11, 13 multiples, at least in good times. So, PE is going to keep coming in there, and that's all going to change. But right now, they actually think, or they know that a lot of these families will step up and put money in.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, if I can add to it. I mean, even in the downturn, we're seeing average multiples of about 12x in the commercial sector, which is kind of mind-boggling when you think about where we are in terms of the cycle and people are still paying. But I agree with you 100%, Steve, that the flow of private equity funds into the sector is changing kind of the nature of it. But it still really is a small community of professionals that work in the sector. And there's a lot of personal relationships there. People have been doing business, for example, with the Boeing company for 30 years, 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And it's still got that very personal flavor to it that's slowly being eroded by the influx of PE, but certainly has many years to go before it's been kind of run out of the industry.
Okay, great. All right, cool. Any other thoughts, Steve or Walt, on your situation?
Only thing I'll add is the company's doing great now. As a matter of fact, Steve, they've consolidated a couple of sites, picked up some very lucrative defense contracts and some contracts from overseas, and they've managed to really, not let a good crisis go to waste, as we like to say in the restructuring industry. So companies well-heeled, not sold yet, but as soon as they do, Steve, I'll give you a call and we'll get that transaction closed too.
Okay.
Hopefully with some of you on the phone.
Sounds good. I'll jump into our second case study. We've got a few minutes. A lot of this will sound familiar. So this company, a middle market entity, their parts are on aircraft engines, airframes, a tier 2. They're primarily here in North America. I mean, they had a plant in Germany, but 3-4 plants in the Midwest, one in New York, one in Connecticut. Company had been around since 1949, family owned. 2 shareholders, so well established. Just to give you an idea, a couple $100 million in revenue top line. The bank debt was about 60 million.
Do we need to move ahead a couple slides? I think.
Yeah, it's
3
okay.
slides. All right.
Yeah, that's okay. Thanks. So the company was doing a couple $100 million in revenue. The bank debt was 60 million, $30 million revolver, $30 million term. They had capital leases of another 10, and as I said, privately owned with 2 shareholders. Long-time relationships with customers. Pratt & Whitney, GE, Sikorsky, BAE, Goodrich, etc. I mean, in a nutshell, they had 2 unprofitable plants, a low equipment utilization among all their facilities. They produced a lot of data from their ERP software, but not a lot was really done with it. We felt like there was a lack of best practices in their manufacturing among plants, and they needed to fill some spots as well. The challenge was pre-COVID. The company had grown through acquisitions, which was a successful strategy, but it was primarily funded through bank debt just over time. So there was periods of times in the cycle where they had high leverage and tight liquidity. So the company, just before we got involved, they had incurred some losses resulting from integrating 2 recent tuck-in acquisitions. And just for definitional purposes, what I call tuck-ins, relocating an acquisition to within their own facilities. And some of the headaches that came out of that, the machinists didn't come with the company. That proved to be a big problem. And then just the portfolio mix of what was being made in the plants, they just didn't fit well. So they came across losses. They tripped some covenants, their fixed charge coverage and their leverage covenants, and leverage was pushing 5 times. So the bank was getting nervous. The risk ratings were going up. Cost to keep the loan was going up, and it was just some lender fatigue there that had been there even before we got there. So shortly into it, the bank group decided to exit the credit and forbear on the defaults, and they had a pretty tight timeline to get paid off, whether it was a refinancing, recapitalization. I mean, they didn't really care. They just wanted to get paid off. COVID hit, that pumped the brakes on everything. Revenue declined by well over 25%. EBITDA was bleeding by more than 50%. It was positive, but big reductions. If nothing else was done, the company was on trajectory to exhaust cash, potentially now impair the lender's 100% recovery, and Chapter 11 was maybe on the horizon if nothing else was done. But we started on a performance improvement plan. Management was slow to ownership was slow to move on it, but we did get them going on it. A lot of it, we had to get into the weeds and look at, why there was so much downtime, the cycle times and the scrap and what have you. So we kind of rolled up our shirt sleeves there. We closed a couple of plants. We got rent concessions from landlords. A lot of things that you'd normally see. We reduced inventory levels to free up cash flow and provide for a better match of production requirements to inventory procurement. Interestingly, though, the ownership initially was pushing back on reducing the inventory levels because the customers wanted to keep them at higher levels, but it just wasn't economically feasible. The company was periodically testing the capital markets to get the banks paid off. Just a little different nuance in that case. Deloitte Capital Markets had a long-time relationship with the company, so they were actually handling that piece, and we were doing the workout restructuring and keeping them afloat and making sure they had liquidity to get to that point.
Hey, Mike,
So-
can I ask a question?
Yeah,
So as you were driving through and reducing inventory, how many kind of production problems did that cause? I mean, did you uncover a lot of rocks when you cut the inventory levels?
we did.
Yeah.
We did, and when I look back at that, I kind of wondered if ownership knew that was going to happen or management knew that was
Yeah.
going to happen. It sure felt that way.
It's funny because you walk around these plants. I do a lot of due diligence work for people, and a private equity owner or potential owner will say they got way too much inventory, and you walk around and you say, yeah, they're probably turning inventory 2-3 times a year. But when you look at their underlying business process, if you wipe out a lot of that inventory and try and free up the cash, you're going to create a lot of problems. So before you wipe the inventory, let's create some process. Here, you didn't have much choice. You gotta get the cash and deal with the issues. But it's something that is really common in this sector is people hide their inefficiencies and their lack of process with a lot of inventory. And it just makes things easier if you got plenty of material to move around the factory.
Yeah. Thanks for that.
Sure.
So ultimately, Deloitte did get them recapitalized. With 5 times leverage, we were mostly focusing on the non-bank lenders. They did close on a recap. It was equity, so the bank group got paid off 100%. The capital leasing guys stayed in, and they put a slug of cash into the bank accounts of the company to help them rebound. So it was really a good outcome for the business. It delevered the balance sheet. Liquidity was much better, and their operating costs were in a much better position as well. And so the company was they were just in a much better position. The 2 shareholders did get diluted. They were still shareholders after the transaction, but they owned less. And while I think that was tough to swallow for quite some time, ultimately they came to realize it's better to have a lower percentage of something than a higher percentage of an airball. So with that, I just turned to some final thoughts, and we're getting close to 5 o'clock, and maybe I'll just turn it over to the group and see if any of you guys have any final thoughts.
Nothing for me.
Sounds like, Mike, that was a pretty successful turnaround and restructuring. I mean, what's the old saying? Show them death and sickness looks pretty good. But the owners were able to stay in and potentially make some of that back in the end. But those kinds of issues in the aerospace sector are kind of endemic. And people ask me a lot, why haven't we seen more bankruptcies through COVID? What happened? How did these companies stave off bankruptcy? And I really attribute it to like 3 or 4 main things. You had Boeing continuing and Airbus continuing to buy at high rates well into the downturn, adding liquidity. You had just billions of dollars, or in fact, trillions of dollars of federal aid come into the system. You had lenders who were not moving on non-performing loans or were being excessively compliant with requests. And then you had equity buyers out there who continued to come in and do transactions even in the down market. And when you look at all those different aspects of it, it just pumps so much liquidity into the market that most companies were able to avoid, like this one, a filing. And I think that it surprised me. I was expecting to see a much higher filing rate last year. But it really avoided kind of a meltdown in the sector.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for that, David.
Dave, quick question. So, with the federal government funds drying up, albeit slowly, lenders getting a little bit less pliant.
Yep.
And the fact that I think you're going to see interest rates tick up on commercial loans 3 points, which it will be mitigated by the competition to make loans created by all the liquidity and PE. But do you think we're going to see more distress?
I think we are. I do, Steve. I think we're going to see it. And I think we're going to see a lot of private equity buyers get off the bench and come in and try and make some good deals for companies that are in a position where they really need some kind of recapitalization. because we're at a point now in the cycle where we can see the upturn. We may not be there yet, but it's in the horizon, and people see the growth story. They know they're not maybe trying to grab a falling knife right now. And if they see that upside sales story, I think we're going to see the consolidation accelerate this year and next year in the sector.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel the same way in terms of not only this sector, but kind of across the board. I think we are going to start to see more loan stress, some loan discounting, some more workouts, and potentially some liquidations. I don't know. It was interesting last week. Just sort of a separate sideline. JP Morgan released their first quarter earnings. They were down 40%, and they increased their credit reserves. Now, there's a lot going into that with JP Morgan. They're a big money center bank, but nevertheless, on the other side of the coin now, U.S. Bank also came out and said, well, we're seeing a little better credit quality, and they released some reserves into income. But they didn't say, they did announce slowing commercial loan paydowns and higher loan utilizations. And, lots of reasons for those, but, I am seeing loan balances tick up. A lot of companies, I don't want to say steering away from just in time, but, stepping aside from it and grabbing inventory when they can, just because the supply chains are such a mess.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, Mike, one quick closing thought. First of all, thanks so much to the TMA and Mike, you in particular, for organizing this. I think these are great events, and it's a great time for us to share stories like these two. I would encourage folks to reach out to your credit contacts, because I do think there's a bit of a blind spot for a lot of credit managers, particularly in the ABL space and in the workout space, which, as we all know, has shrunk over the years of relative calm. And particularly in the Midwest region, there's a lot of folks that don't know that they have aerospace exposure because they have a tool shop. What they don't know is, they're getting, 40 to 50% tooling margins on their auto clients, but they're getting 2,800% margins on their aerospace tools. And so when those start to dry up, they may see EBITDA evaporate when it's too late. So it's a good opportunity for all of us to kind of work our contacts to help educate them on some of the information shared today.
That's a great point, Walt. Thanks. Okay, anything else from the group? Okay, great. I just want to thank everybody for participating on the panel. I enjoyed it, and thank everyone who tuned in to us today. And I'll turn it over to Amanda, and she'll break us off into our into groups. I will have to say I've only got about 15 more minutes.